Hello, and welcome to Governing Pandemics 101, an online course offered by the Global Health Center of the Graduate Institute in Geneva. My name is Gianluca Burci. I'm an adjunct professor of international law here at the Graduate Institute, and this is session 2 of the online course. The title of the session is International Roles and Rules in Detecting and Responding to Outbreaks, and it will be composed of 2 mini lectures. The one I'm going to offer you now will talk about the role of the World Health Organization, WHO, and in particular the International Health Regulation, and some of the tools that the international community has at its disposal to prevent, respond, and detect outbreaks of disease. So, no need to say that COVID-19 has been an unprecedented crisis. The people call it crisis of a century, the crisis of a lifetime. It is a health crisis, but it had devastating effect 360 degrees. It touched our lives, it touched the economy, it touched in the international politics, and so on and so forth. And so there's, both in policy setting and in academia, there's a lot of discussion about the causes of this, the long-term effects, but also what it has shown in terms of the fragility of the world, the vulnerability of the world to something which seems as banal as a virus circulating among humans. We should be used to it. There are many things to say, of course. I will focus on the legal and institutional aspects of what happened in the last couple of years, and as I said, in particular on the role of WHO and the International Health Regulation. So, first of all, I hope and assume that you know at least the very basics about WHO. It's an intergovernmental organization set up in 1948. It's an independent organization, but part of the United Nations system. It's very universal. It has 194 member states, and it has a governance, including a health assembly that meets for a week every year, an executive board, a secretariat led by a director general, currently Dr. Tedros, who has been in the front line of the newspaper and in all the media in the last 2 years. Very regionalized organization, very strong regions that also impact in what WHO can do in responding to diseases when you need a certain command and control. The mandate of WHO is very broad. It spans most aspects of public health. It is not like a hospital. It is similar to a Ministry of Health in terms of its role. In terms of normative role, policy setting, technical assistance, being a forum for negotiation. Obviously, when you're in existence for 70 years, many things change and your functions adapt. But it's fair to say that the prevention and response to epidemics and infectious diseases are at the core of the very nature of WHO, of its reason for existence. And that comes from a long history of international cooperation in the field of public health, going back to the 19th century. So, what has WHO been doing? And we can use COVID-19 as an example. It has definitely a number of roles, the normative roles, and the international health regulation are at the center of this, but also a policy setting roles. It has helped member states to come together and to try to take policy decisions on what to do in responding, not only responding to COVID, but also preparing for the next pandemic. We are already looking at the next pandemic, believe it or not, but also assistance to many states and trying to coordinate and participate in other important multilateral initiatives like the famous COVAX. You will have all heard about COVAX that try to ensure an equitable allocation of COVID vaccines. Let's start with taking a look at the international health regulations. I use IHR for brevity, are a binding legal instrument. They are not a recommendation, they're similar to a treaty. I will not go into details on how they enter into force and so on, but there's no doubt that states must comply with their obligations. And so that's one of the purposes of the IHR. It is a very universal instrument. It has 196 states. Basically, every state in the world is party to the IHR. It reflects the high priority given by WHO in having harmonized rules for the whole world. Because if you don't have at least a basis of harmonization of response, it is very difficult to protect yourself from epidemics, from pandemics. And I'm afraid that COVID has shown the price that we have paid in the lack of coordination, in the lack of unity, if you want, in the response to this. So the IHR, with all the criticism that we look at in a moment, is still the centerpiece, legal, operational, but also from a policy perspective in trying to prevent and respond to outbreaks of diseases. What are some of the main features of the IHR? And let me add, the IHR has been thoroughly revised in 2005. IHR is an old instrument that even predates WHO, but its model was very obsolete, was based on a list of diseases, was based on a very static model of cooperation. And so after the SARS pandemic in 2003, member states decided we need something more contemporary, more up-to-date, that really respond to the globalization of risk. And so it was revised in 2005, entered into force in 2007. What are some of the features of the IHR? One is it's a modern instrument in the sense that it's open to all risks, not only the COVID kind of risk or the natural spread of a pathogen, but also, for example, a chemical spill that spread disease internationally, or a nuclear accident, or even an act of terrorism, that bioterrorism, for example, where disease spreads across countries. So you can already see how political it can be. It's not just public health. It had to do with national and international security, and that's a very distinctive features of the IHR. Its approach is also very modern because it's based on a dynamic joint work between WHO and member states in detecting an event, assessing the risk, managing the risk. So it has not always performed to what we expected, but the philosophy of the instrument, I think, is very solid and is very representative of the globalization of risk in the 21st century. What do states have to do? First of all, they need to have what we call core capacities, and I'll talk about that in my second lecture. Second, they have two obligations of due diligence, good faith, and transparency. They need to be able to detect outbreaks in the territories. They need to assess what's happening. They need to inform WHO, inform other states, continue to provide information. It's really transparency and good faith. And if you remember in January, February 2020, that was some of the problems, the criticism against China, whether legitimate or not. But so that's a fundamental issue of I would say, good citizenship. The other is limitation in national measures, self-restraint. And that's another problem in COVID. States can adopt a protective measure, but they have to do that in accordance with science, with evidence, and somehow be restrained, also for solidarity with other states. WHO is very striking. The IHR has been defined as a managerial instrument because WHO, the Secretariat of WHO, has really a central role in performing surveillance, in trying to detect outbreaks through the internet, through social media, through information that it can get from various sources, and so on. It has a dialogue with states. Again, it's not a static model. It can receive information, impart information, using very aggressively its website to receive information and give guidance and information. And COVID has been a very good test of the importance of the IT technology for the purpose of global health. It has a striking risk management power. It can declare an emergency, public health emergency of international concern. It can adopt recommendations on what to do to respond to these emergencies and so on. It seems something like logical and normal, but it is not. If you look at other technical organizations, there are not many that have these very striking, I would say, operational and managerial powers. The other compromise is what we call the grand bargain. In other words, states have given a lot of power to WHO, have accepted to take like a back seat. They're not at the center of the management of emergencies, WHO is. But in return, they've kept for themselves the power, the authority to take final measures for the protection of the population. And we've seen in the case of COVID, travel restriction, trade restriction, compulsory quarantine, isolation, you cannot even go back to your country for a long period of time. And this they can do legitimately and legally under the IHR. There is an Article 43 that was one of the most difficult to negotiate. But obviously, it's a grand bargain that has its problem, its drawbacks, because states have quite a huge discretion in what to do without much accountability. And that I think is shown the limits of this model. And that's something that many states want to fix or at least to correct in the future. And then finally, if you manage risks so broadly, inevitably measures will impact and will interfere or will interface with other bodies of international law. Think of trade limitation, for example. Think of travel restrictions that limit human rights. And so if you look at the IHR, the way that they've been designed to try to be as consistent as possible with other bodies of international law, to try to avoid conflicts, where a state has to say, either I respect my human rights obligation or I comply with the IHR. That's a very undesirable state of affairs. There has been a very conscious effort to try to reconcile the different bodies of law. The role of WHO obviously goes beyond the management of the IHR. As I said, it has a broad role. It has acquired a operational and emergency role after the Ebola outbreak in 2014. It set up an emergency program that does things that WHO never did before. And one of the striking aspects of COVID is that the IHR had disappeared for a while. If you look at the website of WHO, if you go back to 2020, WHO itself did not mention the IHR for quite a long time. You will remember all the guidance that WHO put on the web, on the wearing of masks, on the transmission of COVID, on what to do in case of emergency, how to ensure that the public health wouldn't stop with COVID. All these very important recommendations and guidelines and information were put on the web outside the framework of WHO. Why is that? Precisely because of the limits and the challenges that the COVID-19 has revealed on the model of response or the model of management of crisis focused on the IHR. What are some of these limits and what is being done about them? First of all, a sense that the alert system that WHO has been using is too binary. Right now, either we have an emergency or we have nothing. And reality is more complex than that. So there are proposals in the future, hopefully, reform of the IHR to replace this very binary black and white system with something much more incremental, much more context sensitive. The second is the core capacities, and I'll talk about that in my second lecture. The third is that unlike many normative treaties, think for example of many environmental treaties, the IHR don't have an institutional system of accountability, of monitoring and assess compliance. That's a huge gap, a huge flaw. That has, for example, allowed countries to impose all these unilateral measures without any clarity whether they are complying with the IHR, breaching the IHR. It has prevented mutual learning among states and so on. So that to me is a major problem. The other is the dependence of WHO on states to get information. As I said before, WHO in principle can get information from many sources, but from political reasons, from reasons of being a member state-driven organization, it has always hesitated to basically put unverified information online. And this has been a barrier sometimes to give a timely alert, to be quicker. And again, go back to early 2020, you remember all the criticism about China not being very transparent and so on. Another weakness, another challenge is, and that's very important, is the insufficient incentives and deterrence. Go back to the end of 2021. South Africa notified this Omicron variant. So South Africa did what it was supposed to do in the IHR. Immediately, a number of countries panicked, overreacted, and suspended flights, did things that basically deter another country from coming clean, from being transparent, and so on. So having a set of deterrents and incentives would be very important in ensuring the effectiveness of the IHR. Another important point, and I'm sort of rattling off all these problems, is the limited scope of the IHR. IHR is all about detection and containment. It has proved ineffective at coordinating an international response to a grave emergency like COVID, and it does not address the prevention, how to prevent the outbreaks from occurring. For example, jumping from animal to humans. That's why we have all this discussion about the pandemic treaty that will pick up where the IHR has left. Another couple of challenges, one is financing. Obviously, you cannot have a credible system of health protection if you don't have adequate financing. And financing for two aspects. One is national capacities, the other we what we call a bit rhetorically as global public goods. For example, facilitate research and development, scientific cooperation, manufacturing of vaccines, allocation of vaccines, and so on. There are many discussions that go way beyond WHO, have to do with the United Nations, with the G7, with the G20, with this political network, of what is a credible system of financing global health security will be. And of course, this will have an impact on also the effectiveness of the IHR in the future. So what is happening now? These are some of the challenges. I could mention more, but just to give you a sense of what COVID has revealed in terms of the limits of the IHR. The Health Assembly has set up in May of last year a working group open to all member states that has to look at the various recommendations, the various reviews, to make proposals on how to improve the international system of global health security. Part of this is looking at the IHR. The United States in January of this year has proposed quite a broad set of amendments that will be considered by the Health Assembly in May. But there's not been much discussion about that. I don't think that it will be adopted in May. And so the work will continue beyond May 2022 at looking at the IHR as a part of a broader system of global health security, and will probably spill over into 2023. And hopefully the convergence on what is supposed to be done will make it possible to improve these instruments and also to strengthen the role of WHO in future pandemics, if not in trying to end this one.